yourself.
Few games have ever sparked so much emotional debate and division as The Last of Us Part 2. This game is about one thing: violence and the cost of revenge. Naughty Dog didn't just tell a story, they forced players to confront uncomfortable truths about morality, about vengeance, and about what it means to lose yourself in the pursuit of justice. Whether you loved or hated it, The Last of Us Part 2 left its mark on gaming history. Hello and welcome, my name's Linksy, and today we're deeping into The Last of Us Part 2 and the never-ending cycle of violence that consumed Ellie after Joel's death. To understand The Last of Us Part 2, you have to go back to where it all started. In 2013, The Last of Us redefined what video game storytelling could be. It wasn't just another post-apocalyptic survival game. It was an emotional gut punch, a character-driven masterpiece that forced players to question morality, survival, and the meaning of love in a world without rules. Every decision the player made felt weighty, and shaping a world where the lines between right and wrong are blurred with every step forward. It wasn't just a game, it was an experience, and one that stuck with players years after the credits rolled. And then came The Last of Us Part 2. The hype was immeasurable. How do you follow up a story that already felt so complete? How do you expand upon a world that already felt so rich and alive? Naughty Dog's answer? By breaking expectations and forcing players into the most uncomfortable, thought-provoking narrative the medium had ever seen. If The Last of Us was about love, Part 2 was about what happens when that love is shattered. If the first game asked, how far would you go to save someone you loved, the sequel asked, what happens when the cost of that love catches up to you? And that question? It divided an entire fanbase. The moment players stepped into the shoes of Abby, everything changed. The game wasn't just telling a story, it was forcing players to experience both sides of a violent, never-ending cycle. Some call it genius, others call it a betrayal, but no matter where you stood, one thing was undeniable, but Naughty Dog wasn't afraid to take risks with The Last of Us Part 2. Few moments in gaming have ever been as shocking, as gut-wrenching as the death of Joel Miller. For 7 years, fans had lived with Joel at the heart of The Last of Us, a deeply flawed but fiercely protective father figure who would do everything for Ellie, and then within the first few hours of Part 2, he was gone. Joel's murder at the hand of Abby was brutal, deliberate, and excruciatingly slow. It wasn't just about killing him, it was about making him suffer. For Ellie, who had just begun to rebuild a fractured relationship with Joel, it was pure devastation. She was forced to watch, pinned to the ground, powerless, as the one person who meant everything to her was beaten to death with a golf club. And just like that, The Last of Us Part 2 became a story of vengeance. The path of blind vengeance. Joel's death ignites something in Ellie that we've never seen before. A pure, unrelenting rage. She doesn't just want revenge, she needs it.
How many came with you? Just you two?
You can't stop this.
It's the only thing keeping her going. We see it as the way she tears through Seattle, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake. Every time she interrogates someone, every time she kills, it's not just about Abby. It's about making the people who took Joel away from her suffer the way she suffered. The most striking thing? Ellie thinks this will bring her closure, that each life she takes will make the pain hurt just a little less. But it doesn't. It never does. Ellie and Abby, two sides of the same coin. What makes The Last of Us Part 2 so compelling is that Ellie's journey is a mirror image of Abby's. The very thing driving Ellie is the same thing that drove Abby to kill Joel in the first place: revenge. Abby witnessed Joel murder her father, the Firefly surgeon who could have created a cure for the cordyceps infection.
Is he still in the fucking building? Abby.
No!
Abby, don't look.
Dad! Dad! No! No!
Just like Ellie, she was consumed by grief. She spent years training, getting stronger, and preparing for the moment she would take her revenge. When she finally does it, she thinks it will bring her peace, but it doesn't. The emptiness remains. And yet, Ellie doesn't see it, not at first. The game forces us to watch these two women walk identical paths. Paths that are soaked in blood. One of the most powerful examples of this is how their most violent acts parallel each other. Abby beating Joel to death while Ellie watches helplessly. Ellie torturing Nora, beating her with a pipe, breathing heavily with wide open eyes as she delivers the final blow. In that moment, Ellie becomes Abby. The same thirst for revenge, the same willingness to cross any line to get it. The only difference is that Abby already had reached the end of the road, that she had killed Joel, and she knew it didn't fix anything. But Ellie, she's still walking towards that dark abyss, convinced that if she just kills Abby, it'll be all worth it. It won't be, but she hasn't realized that. Why do we have to play as Abby? This question looms large in The Last of Us Part 2. especially after the gut punch moment when Joel is killed. In that moment, we're all fired up, ready to track down the killers and see justice done. We return to Ellie, and we do exactly that, hunt down those responsible. We're in her shoes, living her revenge-fueled journey. But then, after the chaos of day 3 at the theater, the game takes a sharp turn.
I know why you killed Joel. He did what he did to save me. There is no cure because of me. I am the one that you want.
You killed my friends. We let you both live.
And you wasted it.
We switch perspectives. Suddenly, we're controlling Abby, the very person who took Joel's life. And it's jarring, it's uncomfortable for many players. It feels like a betrayal. Why make us play as the killer, especially when we've just spent so much time living through Ellie's grief and anger? But this switch up is genius. Naughty Dog doesn't just ask us to understand Abby, they make us live her story. We see her pain, her trauma, her motivation, not as an outsider, but as someone who controls her actions, feels her loss, and ultimately starts to question the same things Ellie does. The game isn't just about showing us Abby's side, it's about forcing us to empathize with her. In a way, we become Abby. We fight for her survival, we learn about her past, and we're forced to acknowledge that her violence comes from the same deep, painful place that Ellie's does. Every action she takes echoes the choices Ellie has made. This mirroring becomes impossible to ignore. It's frustrating at first, because playing as Abby feels like we're abandoning the mission we've been on, avenging Joel's death. But as we get deeper into Abby's backstory, we realize that she, too, is caught on the same cycle of vengeance. She's not just an antagonist, she's a reflection of the same broken world that Ellie is trying to navigate. Her actions, while brutal, are born out of a need for justice, much like Ellie's. By forcing us to walk in Abby's shoes, the game flips the script on the concept of revenge. We're not just hearing her side, we're feeling her pain, her guilt, and her confusion. And in the process, we're forced to confront our own feelings about revenge. The discomfort we feel in playing Abby is intentional. It's the game's way of making us face the complexity of the situation. It's no longer about who's right, it's about the human cost of the choices we make, whether we're Ellie or Abby. As we move through Abby's story, we start to see things differently. By the time we return to Ellie, the lines are blurred. We're no longer simply rooting for Ellie to exact revenge on Abby. We understand the futility of it. The game doesn't just make us choose between two sides, it forces us to question our own morality and our investment in the cycle of violence. And that's what makes this narrative so powerful. It doesn't ask us to take a side, it asks us to reflect on how we would feel if we were on either side of this never-ending conflict. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't just tell a story of vengeance, it makes us live it, feel it, and question whether it's worth the cost. But is Ellie the villain of her own story? At its core, The Last of Us Part 2 is a story about revenge and its devastating cost. But what if the person seeking vengeance is as much as the victim as the one being hunted? As we follow Ellie down her brutal path, we see the damage revenge does, not only to those around her, but to herself. The question is inevitable. Is Ellie the villain of her own story? Ellie's entire journey in this game is defined by her need for retribution. She's consumed by the idea that avenging Joel's death will restore some kind of balance, but instead, every act of violence she commits leads to the same hollow emptiness. Ellie kills, she hurts, and she loses pieces of herself with each step. By the end of the game, she's lost her friends, her sense of morality, and most tragically, her ability to find peace. The futility of revenge is laid bare. It doesn't heal the wounds, it only deepens them. In the final confrontation with Abby, Ellie has the opportunity to break the cycle. She can end it, she can choose forgiveness, but instead, she chooses the same path that led her here in the first place. She lets Abby go, but not out of kindness, it's out of exhaustion. A realization that the violence has already taken more from her than it's worth. And yet, in that moment, Ellie has already lost everything that mattered. She's not the same person she was before the cycle of revenge took hold. Her humanity, her innocence, her joy, gone. Ellie might have spared Abby's life, but in doing so, she's lost herself. Ellie's decision to spare Abby doesn't change what's already been taken from her. The consequences of her choices, of Joel's choices, are irreversible. What started as an attempt to protect someone she loved turned into a chain of events that destroyed everything she held dear. Joel's decision to save Ellie from the Fireflies, from the chance to potentially save humanity, might have been out of love, but it set into motion Ellie's tragic journey. That choice doomed her. not just because of the pain it caused, but because it birthed the endless cycle of vengeance she would come to embody. The idea that revenge will somehow balance the scales is a dangerous illusion. The cycle doesn't stop, it just grows, becoming bigger and more destructive, and ultimately more meaningless. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't just explore the personal consequences of revenge, it reflects the broader and often tragic nature of human conflict. In the end of the game forces us to confront the ugly truth. Vengeance might offer a moment of satisfaction, but it never offers peace. Well, why did this game divide the fandom? When The Last of Us Part 2 was released, it didn't just spark a debate, it created a full-blown divide in the gaming community. Some hailed it as a masterpiece of storytelling, while others felt betrayed by the choices made in its narrative. So what is it about this game that had such a powerful impact, both positive and negative? For many, the major turning point that soured their experience was Joel's death. The shock was enough to rip away any sense of security players might have had. Joel wasn't just a character, he was the heart of the first game. His brutal murder at the hands of Abby in the opening hours left many players in a state of disbelief and anger. The pain of losing him wasn't just emotional, it felt like a betrayal of everything we'd been through with him in the original The Last of Us. This decision left a bitter taste in the mouths of fans who wanted to see Joel as the hero, not the victim. Then came the forced Abby gameplay. Players are thrust into Abby's perspective. Someone who, at first, seemed like the villain, someone whose role in the story is the reason for Ellie's grief. But the game doesn't just give you an option to skip her sections. Instead, it forces players to spend hours with her, learning her backstory, her motivations, and ultimately empathizing with her. For many, this was a difficult pill to swallow. How could the game expect us to like the person who killed one of our most beloved characters? It felt like a betrayal of the player's own emotions, as if we were being manipulated into seeing Abby as more than the monster she seemed to be at first. The ending, too, left a lot of fans dissatisfied. It wasn't a neat, satisfying conclusion. There's no true win for Ellie. Instead, there's a bleak sense of futility. After everything she's gone through, after all the violence, the pain, and the loss, Ellie walks away with nothing. This isn't the kind of ending fans were used to in video games, where protagonists tend to find some semblance of victory or redemption. No. In The Last of Us Part 2, there were no clear winners, just survivors. But for others, this was precisely what made The Last of Us Part 2 a masterpiece. The boldness of its storytelling was something we'd rarely seen in gaming before. The game didn't just give us the comfort of a predictable story arc, nor did it hold our hands through the emotional journey. Instead, it forced players to face uncomfortable truths about violence, revenge, and the human condition. It dared us to challenge our expectations of what a video game narrative could be. The deep themes of revenge, forgiveness, and the loss of innocence resonated with many, and the emotional weight of the story stayed with players long after they put the controller down. The game's ability to make the players wrestle with their own emotions, challenge their own moral compass, and question the perspectives on justice and empathy is what elevated it from a mere video game to something more profound. But the very thing that made it so powerful is what also made it so divisive. The way the game challenges our morality, forcing us to see both sides of the conflict, makes it impossible to walk away with a clear, unambiguous answer. The fan divide comes from the fact that not everyone is ready or willing to have their sense of morality turned upside down. Some players wanted closure, a hero's journey, and an epic conclusion. Instead, they were faced with something messier, something more realistic, and in that mess, we saw brilliance. Others saw a betrayal. The Last of Us Part 2 is not about winning, it's about loss. It's about how violence consumes us and how vengeance only feeds the cycle of pain and suffering. The only way to break this cycle is to walk away. Do you think the story of The Last of Us was brilliant, or do you think it went too far? I'd love to hear your perspectives on the game and its impact. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe and turn on the bell notification to never miss an upload. Thank you. Goodbye.